it's from my mom. This is kind of like, reminds me of like how sassy she used to be and like her ability to like radiate her positivity on other people. She inspired me to try to be very confident and determined as far as my dreams and my goals. But this definitely brings back some memories. My mom was a lot of personality. She had like her own little vibe, always kind of just like looking out for other people, just always had a smile on her face. My mom had me on her 20th birthday. She was a very young mom, and she was like 27 by the time she had all three of them.
How beautiful we are.
There was always like this sense of like positivity and joy that was like contagious. They were always there. Whether we argue, whether we fight, we still are family, like we're brothers and sisters. When Gary moved in, the atmosphere changed. It felt like he kind of just tried to get dominion over us. Like it wasn't like a love thing, but more of like a you need to respect me thing with him. Hey! Gary was one of those people that whooped you and didn't care where he hit you. If it hit your arm, hit your butt, hit you in the eye. It is what it is to him.
Now, let's go.
The abuse, the aggression, the mental abuse, like it all just kept increasing. I think my mom did defend us against Gary to the best of her ability, but it just kept escalating. And I think it was because my mom started to get more and more fearful of him. I knew he was aggressive and I knew he was abusive, but I never would have labeled him as a murderer.
It's blood everywhere. My name is Tasha. Can you please shoot somebody else?
The cops are calling in already. They're coming.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
They're at 4844. Are you inside their house now?
Yes, ma'am. Lavina!
I didn't even realize I called after her. I didn't even know that. Oh my. Them poor kids. Oh, them poor kids. Lavita loved her kids. She did. She really loved them. And it was nothing she wouldn't do for them. JT asked for a cup of sugar, and Jared said, "Where that fine girl at?" And I said, "Huh?" I said, "You talking about my daughter?" "Yeah, she fine. She gonna be my wife." And then JT said, "She can't be your wife. She gonna be my wife." He said, "Boy, please." And then they started like pushing at each other. I think Jasmine may have even jumped in and said, "Both of y'all ugly." Lord have mercy. That's a good picture. I knew Gary wasn't a good fit for her and her family. I felt like Levita could do better than Gary due to the fact that he didn't have real good interaction with her kids. I would hear him in a rage towards the whole family, from the 6-year-old all the way to Levita. It's like, I'm mad at me for not paying attention when all the signs were there. Why didn't I call the police the first time I knew something was ugly going on inside the house?
Spending 10 years in homicide, we see a lot of terrible things. And, you know, you try to manage that. I try to forget a lot. In this case, there isn't forgetting this. On the evening of September 21st, 2009, my partner and I were working the evening shift when this call came in from patrol officers requesting homicide detectives to respond to a crime scene. So when I walked in the house, this is your typical middle-class home. You know, everything is orderly and neat. Big screen TV, comfortable furniture in the living room. And then we go into the master bedroom where it's in disarray. The mother is lying on the floor, on her back, deceased. Definitely something very horrible happened to her. Clearly, you know, she's a victim of multiple stab wounds. The master bathroom, going in there, my gosh, the blood on the floor was immense. It was just bad. And of course, the worst thing of all is you have a small child bound, lying on the floor in front of the tub. What happened in that bathroom is just terrible. The young daughter laying against the bathtub is bound, but we see no traumatic injuries to her. There isn't a stab wound. There's no sign of blood. There's no trauma to this little girl that we can see. We don't know why she's dead. We just know she is. So we're trying to interpret what happened here.
I remember her laying there. A lot of it I've tuned out because I don't want to remember all of the ugliness about it. It took a long time just to get it out of my head. I had my food and I was watching TV. And then we had a beat on the door. Someone was like beating. When we got to the door, it was Jared and JT. And JT was crying, just uncontrollably. And Jared had the phone. He was talking on the phone and I said, "What's going on? What's the matter?" He said, "I'm talking to 911. And I'm like, okay, like, I don't even know how to take this. So I take the phone from him. I'm on the phone with 911, and I'm telling the lady, I don't know what's going on. Let me go in here and see what's going on. Stay right here.
Don't touch that, okay?
I don't want to.
Inside of 3844 now?
Yes, ma'am. I'm leaving back out. She's not breathing. I'm just a
Not breathing?
No, ma'am.
The mother or the 6-year-old?
The mother, I can't even find the 6-year-old. I'm scared to be in here just in case you come back because I don't know what's going to happen. Oh my God. These poor kids.
I could not believe that this was actually happening to this family. When I came back in the house, I think I hugged them because I couldn't even figure out what to say. I couldn't find any words. How am I supposed to tell them kids that their mama is gone? It was just a horrible scene. Horrible.
As I'm about to start heading down, our hallway, I hear Jared start screaming out of nowhere. When I seen him come around the corner, it was hard to breathe. Seeing the look in Gary's eyes, it was just this really dark, fierce look in his eyes, like he was out for blood.
You never listen. You're gonna listen tonight, though.
He has Jared by the collar like this, and is just walking him with the cutlery in his other hand. They're coming towards me. He comes in, tosses Jared, locks the door, and just says, "Now give me a reason why I shouldn't kill y'all." I was scared. I was terrified. That look and that feeling that he gave me when he said it, it was just okay, I need to respond. But I couldn't, I could not find the words to say anything. So Jared responds, and Gary grabs a knife,
Shut up!
says "shut up" real loud, and just stabs Jared in the stomach. I'm watching the blood kind of come, just absorb into the shirt. When he stabbed Jared, I gave him the biggest push that I could, the biggest push that I could, but he's huge. So it's not it did anything, but it got him off Jared. Jared was trying to talk us out of it. Jared was "Oh, we're too young to die. If you love us, you wouldn't kill us, and we won't tell nobody." And he's just, he's trying his best to talk our way out of it. Eventually, he was "I got something to show y'all."
Get up. Get up. Let's go.
As he unlocks the door, first thing you see is my mom just sprawled out on the floor. Just kind of just plastered there. And her body looked discolored, kind of purplish. And I remember the first thing I did was kind of ran to her and cried. At that point, I just kind of shut down, and I just I fell to my knees. I cried, and just asked her to wake up. I know this is a dream. I know this is a dream. And it wasn't. And then as I look up from crying over my mom, there's Jasmine beside the tub with her hands taped behind her back and her feet taped together. And something broke in me at that point. It was kind of just it wasn't even traumatizing anymore after that. At this point, it was just this is sick. He hands me my mom's phone. He was call the police when I leave. And Gary just looked at him and me and he told us, he was like, you know how I tell y'all, say see you later, never goodbye. He was like, well, this is goodbye. And he drives off.
It's vicious, what he did. What was he thinking? Why was he doing these things? We had 3 handwritten letters. 2 letters that Levita wrote to Gary, pretty much saying that this relationship's over, this marriage wasn't working out, they need to go their separate ways. The 3rd letter is Gary's response to Levita, which we found on the bed. This is the letter that Gary wrote to Levita that we found on the bed in their master bedroom. It has a big blood stain on it. You asked to see the monster, so here he is. The monster you made me. There will be 5 lives taken today, me being the 5th. Pray that the Lord allows my soul to enter heaven. If not, I will burn in hell forever. Frankly, I hope there is a special circle in hell for people like Gary Green. The letter on the bed is a significant piece of physical evidence for us. To have somebody pen their intent ahead of time is very unusual. Gary had planned on killing everybody. Levita, Jasmine, JT, Jarrett, and then himself. That's what was in the letter. And that would have been the case if those 2 little boys weren't able to talk Gary out of hurting them. We're very motivated in finding Gary Green as quickly as possible. We don't know what his state of mind is. He knows what he's done. We've got to get an arrest warrant for him written as quickly as possible and start looking for him. We're going to notify everybody in the surrounding areas within our city who we're looking for. We're going to start a manhunt. We need to find this man.
When we opened the door, our mom was laying on the floor with blood all around her, all on her dresser, all on her shirt, and all on her shoes. And our sister, her little sister, had her arms taped behind her back, and there was blood all around the bathroom, and there was nothing we could do about it.
I haven't heard that since the night I said it. I have suppressed a lot of memories. It is still trauma that I have to deal with. Everything changed after that day.
Gary Green is a violent person. And he's a big guy. He's 6'3", 275. He's a danger to our officers as well as anybody else that comes across him. What is he willing to do? Who knows?
Know that the man is always in control of woman.
Right.
But she always tries to control me. She let me know, telling me that she want to leave me and she want to move on with her life.
So this was yesterday, she's telling you that in a letter form that she wants you to move on. So once you tie Jasmine up in the cord of the tape, you pick her up and carry her into her mom's room?
Yes.
Okay.
she asked me, she had this shot bullet on her face. I bet.
In my opinion, tying Jasmine up and parading her in front of her mother was just him showing Levita who's running things. He was almost proud of what he's done. You know, I showed you, right? Here's your daughter all tied up. Look what I did.
How many times do you think you stabbed her? Are you talking like a couple times or a bunch of times or?
Maybe about 30.
About 30 times, you think?
Jazz is watching all this from the freaking bed, right? So think about this little kid's, the terror in her eyes, seeing her mom attacked like this and she can't do anything. You know, what was going through Jasmine's little mind during all this time and the fear in her heart. You know, Jasmine knew what was fixing to happen. And that bothers me so much because she knows what's fixing to happen to her little, and she can't do anything. She's helpless.
What happened to her?
I just feel the bathtub. Feel her head underneath the water. I still see those images.
Yeah. Pretty horrific stuff.
And I know something like that in real life all on TV.
You know, what a tragic, tragic ending to her little life.
Levita never admitted to me that there was abuse going on in the home. My personal opinion is coming from a person who's been abused before. You just keep the hope. You keep the hope that today when he wake up, it's gonna be different. Today he won't push me. Today he won't hit me. Today he won't spit in my face. But I did empathize with her situation. I saw me in her, and I saw, as far as me, myself, what she could be after Gary. Levita made the choice that they were done, and she was deciding to move forward with her life to raise her kids on her own. He took that choice from her, though. But she stood up. At the end, she stood up and decided, I don't want this anymore. But she just didn't get to live through it because he took that from her.
There's all these factors that go into just like my really only question is why Jasmine? You know? With my mom, I know it was out of anger and hatred, which doesn't make it okay, but it takes out the confusion because I know the reason. But with my sister, it's kind of just like she was 6 years old, yeah. It was very confusing to me for a very long time. She didn't do anything. She literally was just there, wrong place, wrong time. And that takes a lot out of me. Why Jasmine? She had a lot more life to see, you know, like a lot more life to see.
And over. Gary is more of an animal or monster than a human being. And then you ask yourself, how are you supposed to forgive that? How do you forgive that? There's not even words in the dictionary for the type of person that I think he is.
During Gary Green's trial, all his prior bad acts, his prior abuse of women came out. We learn about the abuse of these other girls. He choked them, stabbed them. Gary Green was in a relationship with a woman that he had strangled with cords. She actually provided us photographs of her ligature marks on her neck. It's not surprising that he abused Levita and the children at all. That's his MO. That's kind of what Gary Green's about. Now, did Levita know about his prior abusive relationships? I don't think so. He resents a strong woman, and Levita is a very strong and independent woman. Little Jasmine. School picture. The one thing that really brought tears to the gallery that were there for the trial was when the state introduced the video of Jasmine speaking. So, they did get to hear from her in the trial.
I too sing America. Nobody dares say to us eat in the kitchen. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. We too are America.
Yeah, there were a bunch of people teary-eyed that day, I'll tell you what. Yeah. No little girl deserves what she got. She should be graduating high school. The jury found him guilty of capital murder and handed him a death sentence. The death penalty is for cases like this. It's only for the most extreme, the ones that it's true justice for. He got what he deserves.
Does Gary Green deserve to die?
He took a life. He took two. Destroyed two. I'm not sure if that's equal punishment because that's final for him. Once he's dead, that's final for him. But these two kids that's walking around right here on Earth, what they get? What do they get from him dying? It's not gonna bring their mom back. It's not gonna bring their sister back.
Actions have consequences. If you take a life, your life is taken. And that's just, how the world works. I just want him to feel the same pain I feel. I'm definitely gonna be there. Definitely gonna be there. And if they tell me, I'll put the needle in them myself.
Do I think Gary Green is evil? Yes, without a doubt. To tie up a 6-year-old and force them to watch their mother being attacked for a lengthy period of time and ultimately dying, and to make her watch what's fixing to happen, what her little mind was coming up with, what horrors we're going through, up until including her death. It's, you don't want to go there. The only thing in my interview that caused Gary Green any strife was we had him turn his head when he was drowning Jasmine, and that was it. I hope that act haunts him until his sentence is carried out.
Knowing everything we know now, Are you mad at yourself?
I am. I know what the abuse looks like, and I know how you hide the abuse. You tell everyone that there's nothing going on. I just knew I was looking inside of Levita's house. I knew there was abuse going on there, but I would not call 911. I didn't call social services. I didn't go to the school and say, hey, can y'all step in? Do y'all see anything? No, it's like I played a part in the cover-up because I didn't want to see the family torn apart. To me, it makes me feel like I failed them. I told both of them I was sorry. Because knowing what I know, seeing what I saw, in my mind, I'm saying I'm putting them first by keeping them together when in actuality, I did them the most harm by not saying anything.
When I look at that picture, I see the man that took everything away from me. Gary took away my relationship with my mom. He took away my relationship with my sister. He took away my love for myself. And I don't open up to people because I don't want to let anybody in to betray me. It's made me insecure. It's kept me away from my goals. It's ruined, my relationships, my friendships. And so in a way, it's kind of like he took my life away already. I've had 3 suicide attempts. A lot of the times when I felt suicidal and had my attempts, it was because of the fact I just felt it was the quickest way to get back to them. It is a struggle dealing with it because, don't get me wrong, I'm just not like every day thinking, how sad my life is, how, they're gone, but every now and then, if I feel like I need advice, who am I supposed to turn to? And those are the times when it's the hardest. Or like with my kids, when I feel like I need parental advice, I can't reach out to my mom. So those are the times when it's harder to deal with. And those are the times that I struggle with it. It's my daughter, but it's like my little homie. She's a very sassy character. I definitely see Jasmine when I look at my kids. My daughter Addison looks just like Jasmine. Like, it could be twins. She's very...
The autumn air in Akron, Ohio, has a way of cutting straight to the bone. But on the night of November 14th, 1997, the chill that settled over West Market Street had nothing to do with the weather. It was a darkness that swallowed the neon lights of the local diners, a heavy, suffocating silence that descended the moment 32-year-old businessman Arthur Pendleton vanished into thin air. His luxury sedan was found idling beneath a flickering street lamp, the driver's side door swung wide open, the radio still humming with a low, distorted static, and a half-smoked cigarette burning down to the ash on the pristine leather seat. Money was still in his wallet, his gold watch was still ticking on the dashboard, but Arthur was gone, leaving behind only a pair of scuff marks on the damp asphalt and a community frozen in absolute terror. For days, the sirens wailed through the suburban grid. 9 units tore through the nearby woods, and dive teams dragged the murky depths of the Cuyahoga River, but every path led to a dead end. Every whisper died in the wind, and the case grew cold before the winter snow could even melt. Decades rolled by like heavy fog, turning the horrifying disappearance into a shadowy urban legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of Ohio taverns about the man who stepped out of his car and into the void. Investigators were tired. Evidence boxes gathered thick layers of dust in the basement of the precinct, and the missing man's face faded from the local billboards, leaving a family shattered and a dynamic city haunted by a ghost they could never lay to rest. But beneath the surface of this agonizing 29-year silence, a terrifying truth was festering, a web of deception so intricate, so sinister, that it would eventually tear the fabric of the entire community apart when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. No one could have predicted that the key to unlocking this nightmare did not lie in a forgotten piece of forensic evidence or a sudden deathbed confession, but in the identical DNA and the stolen life of the one person Arthur trusted most. The initial response from the Akron Police Department was swift, a chaotic blitz of flashing blue lights and yellow crime scene tape that cordoned off the entire block on that fateful November night. Yet the sheer lack of physical evidence baffled even the most seasoned homicide detectives. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no blood spatters on the upholstery, no shattered glass, and no fingerprints other than Arthur's own, creating an eerie tableau that looked more like a magic trick than a kidnapping. Neighbors reported hearing nothing but the distant bark of a dog and the sudden, sharp acceleration of an unidentified engine speeding away toward the highway, but the darkness of the pre-dawn hours shielded the vehicle from sight. As dawn broke over the city, the realization set in that a prominent, well-liked member of the community had been swallowed by the night, triggering an unprecedented multi-agency manhunt that stretched across state lines. Volunteers lined up by the hundreds, marching shoulder to shoulder through the freezing rain, combing through abandoned factories, scanning the ditches, and plastering thousands of flyers on every telephone pole from Cleveland to Columbus. Yet, as the weeks bled into months, the frantic energy of the search began to curdle into a grim, exhausting despair, and the investigative files swelled with hundreds of useless tips, false sightings, and dead-end leads provided by psychics and pranksters. The media, which had initially fueled a frenzy of front-page headlines and breaking news bulletins, gradually shifted its focus to newer tragedies, leaving the Pendleton file to languish on a shelf, officially designated as a cold case. The agonizing uncertainty became a permanent fixture in the town, a quiet, throbbing ache for a family that refused to hold a funeral without a body, trapped in a horrific limbo where every ringing telephone brought a surge of adrenaline followed by the crushing weight of disappointment. To understand the profound shockwave that would eventually destabilize this entire investigation, one must look closely at the tight-knit family Arthur left behind, specifically his identical twin brother, Alexander Pendleton, who seemed to bear the heaviest cross of all. In the wake of the disappearance, Alexander was the picture of grief, a man hollowed out by the loss of his genetic mirror, standing before the television cameras with tears streaming down his face, begging the public for any shred of information. He took over Arthur's struggling real estate business, comforted their aging, heartbroken mother, and became the solemn, dependable rock of the family, his presence a constant, bittersweet reminder of the brother who had vanished. Yet, behind closed doors, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift was occurring in Alexander's life, a gradual shedding of his old identity and a meticulous adoption of his missing brother's habits, mannerisms, and financial accounts. Friends noticed that the once reserved, anxious twin was suddenly exhibiting a newfound confidence, driving Arthur's favorite cars, managing his assets with cold efficiency, and slowly alienating anyone who asked too many questions about the past. The police had briefly questioned Alexander in the days following the disappearance, as they did with all close relatives, but his airtight alibi, backed by several prominent local businessmen who claimed he was at a charity gala miles away, completely eliminated him from suspicion. He was, for all intents and purposes, a victim of the tragedy himself, a man trying to survive the unimaginable loss of his other half, and the community rallied around him, shielding him from the harsh glare of public scrutiny. But time has a way of eroding even the most flawless facades, and the perfect life Alexander built on the ashes of his brother's memory was structurally flawed from the very beginning, resting on a foundation of lies that required absolute control to maintain. For nearly 3 decades, the secret remained buried deep within the dark, rich soil of Ohio, protected by the passage of time, the fading memories of witnesses, and the comforting illusion of a tragedy long past. The turn of the millennium came and went. Technology evolved at a dizzying pace, and the old paper files of the Akron Police Department were eventually digitized, transformed into lines of cold, unfeeling code stored in a statewide database. It was this technological revolution that would ultimately prove to be the undoing of the perfect crime, as a new generation of cold case detectives, armed with tools their predecessors could only dream of, began revisiting the unsolved mysteries of the 90s. In early 2026, a routine audit of ancestral DNA databases and advanced forensic profiling brought the Pendleton case back into the spotlight, not because a body had been found, but because a strange, anomalous genetic footprint had emerged in a completely different part of the country. A routine background check for a high-level corporate security clearance in a quiet, upscale suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, flagged a fingerprint card that matched the long-dormant Ohio file, but the name on the modern document wasn't Arthur Pendleton. It was Alexander. The investigator who flagged the file initially assumed it was a bureaucratic glitch, a simple clerical error involving twins, but as they dug deeper into the financial timelines, a terrifying paradox began to materialize. The man living in Arizona, a wealthy, retired philanthropist known to his neighbors as an eccentric but harmless family man, had a paper trail that effectively began in late November 1997, just days after Arthur's car was found idling on that cold Akron street. The realization hit the modern task force like a physical blow. The brother who had wept on television, the twin who had supposedly stayed behind to pick up the pieces, had completely vanished from the grid years ago, while the brother, who was presumed dead, seemed to be living a double life under a stolen identity. The focus of the investigation shifted instantly, transforming from a historical search for a missing person into a high-stakes, covert manhunt for a fugitive who had eluded justice by hiding in plain sight as his own victim. Federal agents and local detectives formed a secret coalition, painstakingly reconstructing the final weeks of Arthur Pendleton's life in 1997, peeling back the layers of corporate fraud, hidden debts, and a bitter, escalating sibling rivalry that had been completely invisible to the outside world. They discovered that far from being the successful entrepreneur he claimed to be, Alexander had been deeply embezzling from the family business, facing imminent financial ruin and a lengthy prison sentence if his brother exposed him. The charity gala alibi that had kept him safe for 29 years began to crumble under intense scrutiny. Modern digital enhancement of the venue's photography revealed that while a Pendleton twin was indeed present, certain physical markers, a small scar near the hairline, the specific posture, matched Arthur, not Alexander. The horrifying truth was suddenly laid bare. The twins had executed a deadly switch, but only one of them had survived the night, using the identical nature of their biology to commit the ultimate act of identity theft. Alexander hadn't just killed his brother. He had stolen his entire existence, staged the disappearance to eliminate the threat of exposure, and then seamlessly stepped into Arthur's shoes to clean out the bank accounts before fleeing the state. The grief, the public tears, the decades of comfort offered to a dying mother, it was all a masterfully orchestrated performance designed to buy time, to let the trail grow cold until he could safely disappear into the desert southwest under a cloud of engineered mystery. The takedown was swift, calculated, and executed with absolute precision on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in the manicured cul-de-sac of the Arizona suburb, bringing a shocking, cinematic end to a run that had lasted nearly 30 years. Alexander Pendleton, now an old man, lines etched deep into his face, but still possessing the unmistakable eyes of the youth from the 1997 missing posters, was surrounded by heavily armed federal agents as he walked out to get his mail. There was no dramatic car chase, no shootout, no desperate plea for mercy. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists and the lead detective looked him in the eye and called him by his real name, the fugitive's shoulders simply slumped, the defiance draining from his body in a single, heavy sigh. The news traveled back to Ohio like a lightning bolt, shattering the peace of the Akron community and sending shockwaves through a family that had spent a lifetime mourning the wrong brother. The arrest blew open the vault of a 3-decade-old cold case, exposing a narrative of unparalleled cruelty and calculated malice that left seasoned law enforcement officials stunned by the depth of human depravity. As Alexander sits in a maximum security holding cell awaiting extradition back to the state where his crime began, the excavation teams are currently descending upon a remote, long-forgotten property once owned by the family, searching for the physical remains of the brother who was erased. The headlines have changed, the mystery has been solved, but the chilling realization remains that the monster the town feared for 30 years wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows of West Market Street, but the grieving brother who stood right beside them, smiling through his tears. The arrest of Alexander Pendleton in the blistering heat of the Arizona desert did not mark the end of the nightmare. Rather, it pulled back the heavy curtain on a grand illusion that had hoodwinked the American justice system for nearly 3 decades. As the 72-hour extradition window opened, the quiet streets of Akron, Ohio, were instantly flooded with national media trucks, satellite dishes cutting into the gray skyline, and a populace utterly paralyzed by the revelation. The realization that the man they had pitted, the son who had held his weeping mother's hand at an empty casket ceremony, was actually the architect of his brother's erasure sent a sickening shudder through the community. Inside the interrogation rooms of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, federal investigators and Ohio detectives sat across from a man who seemed to age by decades the moment his true name was spoken aloud. The polished, affluent exterior of the retired Arizona philanthropist peeled away, revealing a hollowed-out fugitive whose entire existence had been a grueling, 29-year marathon of looking over his shoulder. For hours, Alexander remained silent, his gaze fixed on the scuffed metal table, his hands trembling slightly as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The modern forensic task force, however, did not need a confession. The digital paper trail they had painstakingly constructed over the preceding weeks spoke louder than any admission of guilt ever could. Every financial transaction, every property deed signed with a forged signature, and every interstate border crossing made under a dead man's name was laid out before him like a deck of marked cards. To truly comprehend how a human being could dismantle and assume another person's identity so flawlessly, investigators had to return to the very beginning of the timeline, specifically the high-stakes financial collapse of late 1997. New evidence unearthed from forgotten bank archives in Cleveland revealed that Alexander's real estate venture was not merely struggling, it was a crumbling Ponzi scheme on the verge of catastrophic exposure. He had leveraged millions of dollars in fraudulent loans using forged signatures of wealthy local investors, and the walls were rapidly closing in as federal regulators began a routine audit. The only person who had caught onto the massive deception was his identical twin, Arthur, whose own legitimate business was inextricably linked to the family name and reputation. Archival phone records, retrieved from outdated magnetic tapes, detailed a series of increasingly frantic, late-night phone calls between the brothers in the weeks leading up to the disappearance on West Market Street. Arthur had given his twin an ultimatum: confess to the authorities and face the legal consequences, or he would personally deliver the incriminating ledgers to the district attorney's office on Monday morning. Alexander was trapped in a vice of his own making, facing a ruined reputation, total financial asset forfeiture, and a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. It was during these final, desperate days of November 1997 that the plot transformed from a frantic attempt at financial cover-up into a cold, calculated strategy of fratricide and total identity theft. The mechanics of the switch required a level of psychological malice that left even the most veteran criminal behavioral analysts deeply unsettled. On the evening of November 14th, Alexander did not attend the charity gala as the public had believed for 29 years. Instead, he had manipulated Arthur into taking his place under the guise of a reconciliation meeting. Because they were identical twins, sharing the exact same height, build, facial structure, and vocal cadence, it took minimal effort for Arthur to pass as Alexander to a crowd of distracted, wealthy donors in a dimly lit ballroom. While Arthur was unwittingly establishing a rock-solid, ironclad alibi for his own murderer, Alexander was waiting in the shadows of West Market Street, driving Arthur's luxury sedan to the exact spot where it would later be discovered idling. The precision of the timing was terrifying. Alexander knew down to the minute when the gala would end and when Arthur would return to collect his vehicle. What happened in those dark, pre-dawn hours remains a grim subject of forensic reconstruction, but detectives believe Arthur was ambushed the moment he stepped out of his brother's car to swap keys. There was no shouting, no prolonged struggle that would alert the sleeping neighborhood, only a swift, lethal betrayal executed by someone who possessed the exact same face as the victim. Once the physical deed was done, the true genius of Alexander's horrific plan began to unfold as he seamlessly stepped into the vacuum left by his brother's engineered disappearance. He did not immediately flee the state. To do so would have drawn immediate, burning suspicion from law enforcement and the family. Instead, he stayed behind to play the role of the grieving, devastated brother, a performance that required absolute psychological compartmentalization. He wore Arthur's clothes, studied Arthur's personal journals to mimic his private quirks, and gradually liquidated Arthur's legitimate assets over a period of 18 months under the pretense of keeping the family afloat. The local police, blinded by the sheer tragedy of the situation and hampered by the primitive forensic tools of the late 90s, never thought to question why the grieving twins' fingerprint patterns on certain business documents matched the victim's old records. By the time the family estate was settled and the grief had settled into a quiet, permanent ache, Alexander had successfully funneled over $2 million into offshore accounts and blind trusts. Then, in the summer of 1999, he staged his own quiet departure, telling the community he needed a fresh start away from the painful memories of Ohio, and vanished into the vast expanse of the American West. The modern breakthrough that finally shattered this decades-old deception did not come from a lucky break, but from the relentless, unyielding advancement of genetic genealogy. In early 2026, a distant cousin of the Pendleton family uploaded a DNA sample to a public ancestry database, entirely unaware that their curiosity would trigger a forensic earthquake. Simultaneously, a cold case unit in Akron had resubmitted a tiny, degraded sweat sample found on the steering wheel of Arthur's idling car in 1997 for advanced next-generation sequencing. When the two genetic profiles intersected in the cloud, the algorithm flagged a massive, anomalous distortion. The DNA on the steering wheel belonged to an identical twin, but the subsequent financial activity associated with that genetic marker was actively moving through Arizona banks under Arthur's Social Security number. The realization sent shockwaves through the federal task force. They weren't looking for a skeleton in an Ohio forest. They were tracking a living, breathing ghost who had stolen a dead man's life to escape the law. A covert surveillance operation was immediately launched in Phoenix, with undercover agents tracking the elderly man as he walked his dog, shopped at local organic markets, and interacted with an elite circle of friends who knew him only as a retired, wealthy investor. The psychological profile of Alexander Pendleton during his years in Arizona paints a picture of a man trapped in a prison of his own construction, despite his immense material wealth. Neighbors described him as a fiercely private individual who never allowed photographs to be taken of him at neighborhood gatherings, always volunteering to be the one behind the camera. He had security systems installed at his home that far exceeded the needs of a standard suburban neighborhood, with multiple overlapping cameras monitoring every square inch of his property line. Detectives believe he lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, knowing that a single routine traffic stop, a single fingerprint scan, or a chance encounter with someone from his past could bring his entire empire of cards crashing down around him. When the federal agents finally closed the distance on that fateful Tuesday afternoon, blocking his driveway with unmarked SUVs, the expression on his face wasn't one of anger or violent defiance, but a profound, exhausting sense of relief. The heavy burden of maintaining a 29-year lie, of waking up every morning and pretending to be the brother he had slaughtered, had finally come to an end. As the extradition papers were signed and Alexander was placed onto a private federal transport plane bound for Ohio, the focus of the investigation shifted back to the cold, damp earth of Akron. A team of forensic anthropologists and heavy excavation equipment was deployed to a heavily wooded, 20-acre parcel of land that Alexander had quietly purchased through a shell company just weeks before the 1997 disappearance. The property, located near the jagged cliffs of the Cuyahoga Valley, had remained completely untouched for nearly 3 decades, overgrown with thick brush and hidden behind rusted barbed wire. For 3 days, ground-penetrating radar scanned the uneven terrain, searching for anomalies in the soil structure that would indicate a clandestine grave dug in the dark of winter. The tension at the site was palpable, with detectives, forensic techs, and a few remaining family members standing in the freezing drizzle, waiting for the earth to finally yield its secrets. On the morning of July 1st, 2026, the radar equipment registered a distinct, localized disturbance beneath the roots of an ancient, rotting oak tree, prompting the excavation team to switch to hand shovels and delicate trowels. The discovery made in that shallow Ohio grave confirmed the darkest theories of the prosecution and sealed Alexander Pendleton's fate beyond any shadow of a doubt. Buried 6 feet beneath the clay were the skeletal remains of a man still wearing the remnants of a high-end, late 90s tuxedo, the very outfit Arthur had worn to the charity gala to establish his brother's alibi. Alongside the remains was a rusted iron crowbar and a heavy, plastic tarp, preserved by the unique chemistry of the surrounding soil. The forensic pathologists at the scene identified multiple blunt force trauma fractures to the rear of the skull, indicating that the victim had been struck from behind without warning, a cowardly assault that left him no opportunity to defend himself. The ultimate irony of the case was found in the victim's pocket, a small, metallic keychain containing the keys to Alexander's real estate office, the very place where the incriminating financial ledgers had been stored. The physical evidence was a devastating, irrefutable echo from the past, a voice from the grave that cut through 29 years of deception with absolute clarity. The news of the body's recovery spread through Akron like wildfire, bringing a grim, solemn closure to a case that had haunted the city's consciousness for a generation. The local courthouse, where Alexander is scheduled to be arraigned on charges of first-degree murder, grand theft, and identity fraud, has been fortified with extra security to handle the massive influx of public onlookers and international journalists. The legal community views this as one of the most unprecedented trials in Ohio history, a case that will push the boundaries of forensic genealogy and psychological profiling to their absolute limits. Prosecutors have already indicated that they will seek the maximum possible sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Alexander will spend the remainder of his natural life behind the bars of a maximum security prison, stripped of both his stolen identity and his freedom. The dynamic city that had spent decades looking at a missing poster with a sense of helpless sorrow is now forced to confront a far more terrifying reality, that the monster they feared was never a stranger in the dark. Inside the local taverns and community centers where Arthur Pendleton's name had once been spoken with a quiet, reverent sadness, the conversation has now turned to the sheer, incomprehensible coldness of the crime. People look back at old television news footage from late 1997 with a newfound sense of horror, watching Alexander sob into a handkerchief, pleading with the kidnappers to bring his brother home safely. Every tear, every tremble in his voice, and every desperate prayer he uttered before the cameras is now viewed through the chilling lens of truth, a masterclass in psychopathic manipulation designed to throw the police off his scent. The family members who survive have retreated into absolute privacy, refusing to issue statements to the press, crushed by the dual realization that Arthur is gone forever and that his killer was the very person they turned to for comfort during their darkest hours. The shadow that has hung over West Market Street for nearly 30 years has finally shifted, but the chill remains, a permanent reminder of the day a brother's love was revealed to be a deadly, calculated illusion. The formal arraignment of Alexander Pendleton at the Summit County Courthouse in downtown Akron was an event that defied the typical gravity of legal proceedings, transforming the limestone monument of justice into a theater of collective public trauma. Outside the heavy bronze doors, barricades line the sidewalks as hundreds of residents stand in the damp morning air, hoping to catch a fleeting glimpse of the man who had executed the most audacious identity theft in modern criminal history. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere is suffocatingly tense, filled with the sharp scratching of reporters' pens and the low, anxious murmur of retired investigators who had flown in from across the country to witness the ghost they had chased for nearly 30 years finally brought to heel. When Alexander is led into the room, his wrists and ankles shackled, the contrast between his current state and his former life as a gilded Arizona socialite is stark, almost violent. He wears the bright orange jumpsuit of a maximum security inmate, his shoulders stooped, his silver hair unkempt, and his eyes staring fixedly at the floor to avoid the burning gazes of his remaining family members who fill the front row. The clerk reads the indictment with a steady, unfeeling cadence. Aggravated murder, kidnapping, identity fraud, grand theft, and compounding a felony, each word dropping into the silent room like a heavy stone, cementing a reality that the city is still struggling to fully comprehend. As the prosecution begins to outline its preliminary case to the judge, a chilling, highly detailed blueprint of Alexander's life during his 29 years on the run begins to emerge from the darkness of secrecy. The state reveals that Alexander did not merely run away to Arizona to hide. He painstakingly engineered a sprawling, multi-state financial labyrinth designed to permanently wash away any connection to his true identity. Using the pristine Social Security number and flawless credit history of his murdered twin, Arthur, he established a web of shell corporations based out of Delaware and Nevada as early as January 1998, while he was still physically living in Akron playing the part of the grieving brother. These corporate entities were used to quietly siphon cash from the family real estate business, disguising the massive theft as legitimate consulting fees and failed real estate investments. By the time he officially left Ohio in 1999, claiming a broken heart and a desire for a fresh start, his stolen fortune had already been laundered through 3 different international banking institutions, emerging in the American Southwest as clean, untraceable capital. The sheer scale of the preparation proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the murder of Arthur Pendleton was not a crime of passion or a sudden panic, but a highly calculated corporate takeover of a human life. The financial forensic team deployed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation had spent the weeks following the arrest tracing every single dollar spent by the fraudulent Arthur in Phoenix, exposing a lifestyle built on an almost psychotic level of discipline and paranoia. Every credit card application, every mortgage agreement, and every tax return filed over the last 2.5 decades bore Arthur's name but Alexander's signature, a meticulous forgery that had been practiced thousands of times until it became second nature. Undercover agents who raided the Arizona estate discovered a hidden wall safe behind a mahogany bookshelf in the study, containing an eerie archive of the crime. Arthur's original birth certificate, his old driver's licenses, his university diplomas, and even his dental records from the early 90s. Prosecutors argue that Alexander kept these artifacts not out of a sense of twisted sentimentality, but out of cold, operational necessity. He needed to memorize every detail of his brother's early life to pass the stringent background checks required for the elite corporate circles he frequented. He had effectively transformed his own mind into a database of his victim's history, burying his true self so deeply beneath the stolen identity that the line between reality and deception began to blur even for him. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation brought forward during the preliminary hearing was the depth of the betrayal inflicted upon the twins' aging mother, Eleanor Pendleton, who passed away in 2014 believing her son Arthur was the victim of a random, senseless street kidnapping. For 15 years after the murder, Alexander, living in luxury in Arizona under Arthur's name, maintained regular contact with his mother through typed letters and carefully timed telephone calls, utilizing a voice modulator to mimic the slightly higher pitch of Arthur's speaking voice. He would tell the heartbroken elderly woman that the trauma of the past had forced him to cut ties with Ohio permanently, but that he loved her and was building a successful life in the desert. The prosecution presented a series of these letters to the court, reading aloud passages where Alexander, pretending to be Arthur, comforts his mother over the loss of her son Alexander, who had supposedly gone missing in the West a few years prior. The raw, calculated cruelty of a man comforting a mother over his own fictional disappearance, using the identity of the brother he had bludgeoned to death, left several members of the jury box visibly shaken and reduced the gallery to a stunned, horrified silence. The defense team, composed of high-priced criminal attorneys retained before Alexander's assets were frozen by the federal government, faces an uphill battle of unprecedented proportions, attempting to construct a narrative of doubt around a mountain of concrete forensic data. They argue that the presence of Alexander's DNA on the steering wheel of the car and the discovery of the body on a property once owned by the family are circumstantial links that do not explicitly prove murder, suggesting instead that Arthur may have committed suicide or fallen victim to a third party, and that Alexander merely took advantage of the tragedy to escape his own crushing financial debts. However, this defense strategy begins to unravel the moment the state introduces the testimony of Dr. Eris Vance, the chief forensic anthropologist who led the exhumation at the Cuyahoga Valley property. Dr. Vance takes the stand with a calm, clinical authority, displaying digital 3D scans of Arthur's skull that clearly show the trajectory and force of the fatal blows, proving that the victim was struck from behind with an iron implement while in a defensive, kneeling position. Furthermore, soil analysis from the grave site matched trace minerals found inside the trunk of Alexander's personal vehicle from 1997, which had been tracked down and impounded from a classic car collector in Michigan just days prior to the trial. The investigation is also shining a harsh, unforgiving spotlight on the systemic failures of law enforcement in late 1997, exposing how a series of small oversight errors allowed a killer to walk out of the police station with $1 million fortune. The original detectives on the case had been so entirely consumed by the narrative of a mysterious, external predator targeting local businessmen that they completely failed to execute basic verification protocols on the Pendleton family itself. Because Alexander was a well-respected figure who held a solid alibi, his fingerprints were never formally taken during the initial missing persons investigation, a fatal omission that allowed him to use his identical hands to sign away Arthur's bank accounts without triggering a single biometric alarm. The retired lead detective, now an 82-year-old man walking with the assistance of a cane, sat in the third row of the courtroom, his face a mask of profound regret as he listened to the modern task force dissect the critical mistakes of his youth. The case has become a cautionary textbook example within the criminal justice community, illustrating how easily bias and a lack of forensic skepticism can allow a sophisticated psychopath to manipulate the system to its breaking point. As the court adjourns for a midday recess, the media circus outside reaches a fever pitch, with legal analysts debating whether the state will seek the death penalty given the extraordinary cruelty and premeditation involved in the crime. The local news channels are running continuous, archival loops of the 1997 search efforts, contrasting the black and white footage of a young, weeping Alexander with modern, high-definition satellite photos of his multi-million-dollar compound in Phoenix. The public fascination with the case is driven by a deep, instinctual horror of the double. The idea that a person can be entirely replaced by someone who looks exactly like them, and that the world around them will never notice the difference. For 29 years, the people of Akron lived next to a ghost story, wondering what kind of phantom could snatch a man from an idling car on a busy street without leaving a trace, only to find out that the phantom was a flesh-and-blood mirror image, living a life of unearned luxury on the other side of the country. The true resolution of this tragedy, however, lies not in the legal arguments or the media spectacle, but in the quiet, solemn work being conducted by forensic technicians at the local morgue, where Arthur Pendleton's remains are finally being prepared for a proper, dignified burial. For nearly 3 decades, he was a nameless anomaly hidden deep beneath the roots of an anonymous oak tree, his memory distorted by the very man who took his life, his name used as a shield to protect a fugitive from the law. Now, as the gears of justice grind forward with an unstoppable force, the truth has finally broken through the clay of the Ohio Valley, stripping the mask from the imposter and returning the stolen life to its rightful owner. Alexander Pendleton's long run from the law has ended exactly where it began, in a cold, gray Ohio courtroom, facing the undeniable evidence of his own monstrous deception, while the city he deceived watches in hushed, trembling anticipation for the final gavel to fall. The legal machinery of Summit County ground forward into the late afternoon, plunging deeper into the dark logistics of a crime that had effectively paused time for an entire community since 1997. With the initial shock of the arraignment settling into a heavy, clinical grimness, the prosecution prepared to introduce its most devastating weapon, the digital forensics of the new millennium applied to the paper trail of the old. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stood before the podium, his voice cutting through the humid air of the courtroom as he presented a series of highly encrypted financial ledgers recovered from a secure server located in Zurich, Switzerland. These files, which had been unlocked via an international mutual legal assistance treaty just 48 hours prior, laid bare the precise timeline of Alexander Pendleton's corporate treason. The records showed that as early as September 1997, a full 2 months before Arthur vanished, Alexander had established a phantom brokerage account under Arthur's name using a forged power of attorney. This was the exact mechanism he used to systematically bleed the family real estate empire white, shifting liquid capital across the globe while leaving his brother to hold the bag for millions in imminent, fraudulent defaults. The sheer audacity of the financial manipulation was matched only by the physical calculations Alexander made to ensure his brother's body would never be found by the primitive search methods of the late 20th century. Federal investigators returned to the witness stand to present a newly discovered piece of evidence retrieved from the crawlspace of Alexander's former Akron residence, a hand-drawn map on yellowed grid paper dating back to October 1997. The map featured precise geographical coordinates, soil depth calculations, and notes on the root structures of specific trees within the 20-acre Cuyahoga Valley property, where Arthur's remains were eventually unearthed. Forensic linguists and handwriting experts testified with absolute certainty that the hurried, precise script on the map belonged to Alexander, written during the exact period he was publicly claiming to be working late at the office to save the family business. This document shattered the defense's lingering narrative that the killing was an accidental escalation of a sibling argument. It proved that the grave had been selected, measured, and prepared weeks before Arthur ever stepped into his brother's shoes at the charity gala. As the afternoon hours waned, the prosecution called a surprise witness whose presence in the courtroom caused a visible stir among the journalists and spectators. Sit in the center of the witness box was 76-year-old Beatrice Lang, who had served as the personal executive assistant to both Pendleton twins during the chaotic years of the late 90s. Lang, her voice trembling but resolute, recalled the escalating friction between the brothers in the final week of November 1997, describing an atmosphere of absolute terror within the corporate headquarters. She testified that 3 days before the disappearance, she overheard a violent confrontation behind the closed oak doors of Arthur's office, during which Arthur openly accused his twin of systematic forgery and threatened to contact the FBI. Arthur told him it was over, Lang whispered into the microphone, the courtroom hanging on every word. He said he wouldn't go to prison for Alexander's greed and that he was compiling the final audit reports over the weekend. Alexander didn't yell back. He just walked out of the office with a face as cold as stone, and that was the last time I ever saw them in the same room together. The defense tried desperately to cross-examine Lang, attempting to paint her memories as unreliable fragments distorted by the passage of nearly 30 years and the intense media saturation surrounding the cold case breakthrough. They questioned her regarding the lighting of the office, her personal feelings toward Alexander, and whether she could truly distinguish the voices of identical twins through a thick wooden door. But Lang remained unshakable, pointing out that while their faces and voices were identical to outsiders, those who worked with them daily could easily tell them apart by their micro-expressions, their temperaments, and the specific way they carried themselves under stress. She noted that when Arthur supposedly returned to the office a week after the disappearance to take control of the company, something felt fundamentally wrong. The man who claimed to be Arthur suddenly had a different posture, signed documents with a slight, unnatural hesitation, and refused to look her directly in the eye when asking about the missing financial ledgers. At the time, she assumed it was the crushing weight of grief altering his personality, but the horrific truth revealed in 2026 finally made all those old, haunting inconsistencies fall into place. The prosecution then shifted the court's attention to the specific forensic science that allowed a ghost to be pulled from the shadows of a 30-year-old mystery, the revolutionary field of investigative genetic genealogy. Dr. Helena Rossi, a pioneer in advanced DNA sequencing who consulted for the FBI's Cold Case Task Force, took the stand to explain how her team bypassed the limitations of traditional forensic databases. In 1997, The state-of-the-art DNA testing only looked at a small handful of genetic markers, which were completely identical between Arthur and Alexander, making it impossible for the original investigators to determine which twin had left the sweat and skin cells on the steering wheel of the abandoned car. However, Dr. Rossi's lab utilized next-generation sequencing to isolate epigenetic markers, chemical modifications to the DNA molecule that are altered by environmental factors, lifestyle choices, and stress over a person's lifetime. By comparing the 1997 crime scene DNA with modern samples taken from the Arizona estate, her team proved that the genetic material on the steering wheel possessed the specific epigenetic signatures of a man experiencing severe financial panic and high cortisol chronic stress, matching Alexander's medical history from that exact month, rather than Arthur's calm, stable biological profile. This high-tech revelation effectively closed the last remaining loophole for the defense, trapping Alexander within the biological reality of his own crime. The elderly fugitive sat at the defense table, his eyes darting toward the projection screen displaying his own cellular structure dissected for the world to see, his fingers twitching in a rhythm that mirrored the static of the old radio found in Arthur's car. The psychological weight of the evidence seemed to physically crush him, his breathing growing shallow as the scientific certainty of his undoing was laid bare before the judge. The community of Akron, watching the live text updates from the courtroom, began to realize that the perfect crime was an impossibility in the modern world. The very passage of time that Alexander counted on to erase his tracks had instead developed the tools necessary to destroy him. Outside the courthouse walls, the city was undergoing a profound reckoning with its own history as the true narrative of the Pendleton family forced people to re-examine every charity drive, every real estate development, and every public interaction the twins had ever engaged in during the 90s. Old friends of the family recalled how Alexander had insistently pushed for a closed-casket memorial service for Arthur just 6 months after the disappearance, claiming it was too painful for their mother to look at an empty space. The community had lauded him for his strength, weeping along with him as he delivered a powerful, heartbreaking eulogy about the inseparable bond of brotherhood and the agony of a half-lived life. Now, that eulogy was recognized as an act of supreme psychopathic theater, a killer celebrating his own survival while looking directly into the eyes of the people he had defrauded, using their empathy as a shield against detection. The afternoon session concluded with the judge denying a desperate motion by the defense for a mistrial based on media bias, instead ordering that Alexander remain held without bail at the Summit County Jail as the trial moved toward the final presentation of physical evidence. The state has indicated that the next phase of the prosecution will involve the testimony of the federal agents who conducted the raid on the Phoenix mansion, promising to reveal the exact moment the 30-year illusion shattered in the Arizona sun. As the security detail led Alexander back to the underground holding cells, his ankles clanking against the concrete floor, a lone voice from the gallery called out into the sudden silence of the room, "Justice for Arthur." The elderly killer did not flinch, he did not turn around, but the slight drop of his head signaled a profound, undeniable admission that the life he had stolen was finally being reclaimed by the law. The morning sun of July 2nd, 2026, struggled to pierce the thick, overcast canopy hanging over Akron, Ohio, casting a cold, cinematic gray over the stone facade of the Summit County Courthouse. As the fifth session of this historic trial commenced, the atmosphere inside the gallery was no longer charged with the frantic energy of a media circus. It had hardened into a quiet, suffocating grimness. The public had begun to realize that they were not just witnessing the resolution of an old cold case, but a deep, clinical dissection of a brilliant, psychopathic mind that had successfully defied the American justice system for 29 years. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance returned to the podium, his posture rigid, holding a heavy manila folder that contained the highly anticipated, top-secret field notes from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Phoenix field office. These documents detailed the final, meticulous movements of the covert tactical operation that brought an end to Alexander Pendleton's stolen life, revealing a level of federal surveillance that read more like an espionage thriller than a domestic murder investigation. Special Agent David Vance of the FBI's Transnational Financial Crimes and Fugitive Task Force took the witness stand, his deep, authoritative voice filling the room with a cold, unsettling precision. Agent Vance testified that by February 2026, the federal government had completely compromised Alexander's digital footprint in Arizona, monitoring every bank withdrawal, every encrypted email, and every security camera feed surrounding his multi-million-dollar suburban compound. Undercover agents posing as utility workers, landscaping contractors, and wealthy real estate buyers had spent months mapping the internal layout of the Phoenix mansion, looking for the specific structural vulnerabilities that would allow for a bloodless arrest. "We were dealing with a man who had lived under an assumed name for nearly 3 decades, Agent Vance explained, adjusting his glasses. He was highly intelligent, financially independent, and possessed the resources to disappear across the Mexican border within a matter of hours if he suspected the net was closing. Every move we made had to be absolute, silent, and completely invisible." The prosecution then displayed a series of high-definition surveillance photographs taken during the weeks leading up to the arrest, projected onto the large courtroom screen for the jury to analyze. The images showed an elderly man with thinning silver hair, impeccable posture, and a sharp, calculating gaze, sitting alone on a manicured patio overlooking the desert landscape. He looked every bit the part of the successful, retired Ohio businessman he claimed to be, but the modern forensic analysts pointed out a subtle, chilling detail that the human eye would normally miss. Using advanced biometric gait analysis software, federal behavioral experts had compared the elderly man's modern walking pattern with grainy, archival security footage of Alexander Pendleton leaving an Akron bank in October 1997. Despite the 29-year gap, the structural skeletal alignment, the specific drop of the left shoulder under stress, and the micro-hesitation before crossing a threshold were an identical match. The science of the human body had betrayed him. While he had successfully altered his name, his records, his family, and his home, he could not rewrite the unique, biological signature of his own stride. The most explosive revelation of the morning came when Agent Vance described the top-secret raid on the Arizona compound's private study, a room that served as the operational nerve center for Alexander's double life. Behind a false wall paneled in dark mahogany, federal agents discovered a highly sophisticated, military-grade communication setup consisting of multiple untraceable satellite phones, encrypted hard drives, and a collection of counterfeit passports from 3 different European nations. This was not the home of a man who believed he had gotten away with murder. This was the tactical bunker of a fugitive who knew, with absolute certainty, that the past was a predator that would eventually catch up to him. Among the seized items was a pristine, unactivated burner phone programmed with a single international phone number leading to a private maritime security firm in Ensenada, Mexico, a digital escape hatch that Alexander had maintained for decades, ready to be utilized at the first sign of a police uniform. As the jury absorbed the sheer scale of the fugitive's preparation, the prosecution introduced the actual audio recording of the arrest, captured by a body-worn microphone hidden on the lead arresting officer on that sunny Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix. The courtroom fell into a dead, paralyzed silence as the audio began to play through the high-fidelity speakers, the sound of birds chirping in the Arizona heat suddenly interrupted by the heavy, synchronized slamming of SUV doors. "Alexander Pendleton, step away from the vehicle and place your hands on your head," a firm, amplified voice boomed through the recording. There was a long, agonizing pause on the tape, filled only with the low hum of a distant lawnmower, before the frail, trembling voice of the defendant could be heard responding. "I've been waiting for you," Alexander whispered on the recording, his voice devoid of anger, fear, or defiance, carrying only the profound, crushing weight of utter exhaustion. "I've been waiting for 29 years. The defense table remained completely motionless during the playback, Alexander staring fixedly at his own hands, his fingers intertwined so tightly that his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. His high-priced defense attorneys looked visibly deflated, their previous arguments about mistaken identity and circumstantial links systematically dismantled by the defendant's own recorded words. The state argued that this spontaneous utterance was the ultimate, legally binding admission of guilt, a psychological confession from a man whose mind could no longer bear the immense structural pressure of maintaining an engineered life. It proved that beneath the polished exterior of the Arizona philanthropist was a killer who knew exactly why the federal government had come to his door, a man who understood that the ghost of West Market Street had finally arrived to claim its debt. The trial then shifted into the dark, financial undertow that drove the fratricide, as the state called to the stand forensic accountant Cheryl Vance, who had spent 4 months reconstructing the collapsed financial empire of the Pendleton brothers in 1997. Vance presented a series of complex, color-coded charts illustrating how Alexander had systematically hollowed out Arthur's legitimate real estate holdings to fund his own disastrous offshore investments. The data showed that by November 10, 1997, just 4 days before the disappearance, Alexander had accumulated over $3 million in uncollateralized debt, using Arthur's personal credit line as a shield against bankruptcy. Arthur was a meticulous, highly conservative businessman, Vance testified, pointing to a sharp drop on the financial timeline. He had just discovered that his twin had forged his signature on a series of high-risk commercial loans. If Arthur went to the authorities, as he threatened to do, Alexander would not only lose his freedom, but he would be utterly erased from the elite social standing he prized above all else. In Alexander's mind, there was only room for one Pendleton twin to survive. The cross-examination of Vance by the lead defense counsel was a desperate, aggressive attempt to muddy the waters, focusing heavily on the chaotic banking regulations of the late 90s and the possibility that Arthur himself was involved in the high-risk financial schemes. The defense argued that Arthur's business was also failing and that the brothers may have mutually agreed to stage a disappearance to collect on a massive corporate life insurance policy, only for something to go tragically wrong afterward. But Vance remained unmoving, producing a certified copy of Arthur's personal last will and testament, updated just 48 hours before his murder, which left his entire estate to a local children's hospital and completely stripped Alexander of any corporate authority. This document, which had been recovered from a secure safety deposit box in Cleveland that Alexander never managed to locate, proved that Arthur was actively cutting his toxic brother out of his life, providing the definitive, unassailable motive for the execution that followed. Outside the courtroom doors, the city of Akron was feeling the profound, unsettling ripples of these daily revelations, as the older generation of residents began to look at the landscape of their town through a distorted, horrifying lens. The local real estate developments, the suburban shopping centers, and the community parks that had been built or managed by the Pendleton Company in the late 90s were now stained by the knowledge of the blood that paid for them. People gathered in small groups on the courthouse steps, discussing how a man could look so completely normal, so devastatingly broken by grief, while holding the coordinates of his brother's shallow grave in his suit pocket. The case had broken the collective trust of the community, serving as a terrifying reminder that the deepest evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes, it wears the exact same face as the person you love most, smiling through the tears of a perfectly executed lie. Ohio 1997 cold case solved. Fugitive twin brother finally caught. Part 6. The stifling heat of the midsummer afternoon seemed to press against the tall stained glass windows of the Summit County Courthouse, but inside courtroom 3B, the temperature remained ice cold. As the sixth session of the state's case against Alexander Pendleton resumed, the prosecution focused its sights on the dark chronological gap between the night of the murder and the suspect's final flight from Ohio. The state's objective was clear: to prove that every single action taken by Alexander from November 15, 1997, until his sudden relocation to Phoenix in the summer of 1999 was part of a cold-blooded, methodical stabilization of his stolen life. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance called to the stand retired forensic handwriting analyst Dr. Julian Mercer, a man who had spent the better part of the previous month analyzing hundreds of corporate checks, property deeds, and personal letters signed during that volatile 18-month window. Dr. Mercer took the stand, carrying a massive leather-bound binder containing high-resolution digital comparisons of the twins' signatures. For nearly 3 decades, the public believed that Arthur Pendleton had simply walked away from his life, leaving his brother Alexander to pick up the pieces of a fractured real estate empire. But as Dr. Mercer projected the documents onto the courtroom screen, the terrifying mechanics of the forgery were laid bare. Identical twins may share the same genetic code, but their fine motor skills and muscle memory are entirely distinct, Dr. Mercer explained, using a laser pointer to trace the loops of a corporate bank authorization dated December 4, 1997, just 3 weeks after Arthur's disappearance. Arthur had a very specific, fluid stroke, utilizing a heavy downward pressure on the pen. Alexander, on the other hand, possessed a lighter, more hesitant stroke with a distinct microtremor when executing capital letters. What we see in every major financial document signed under Arthur's name after November 14th is a highly calculated, slow-drawn imitation. It is the signature of a man practicing an art form, not a man naturally signing his name. The prosecution then introduced a series of personal journals recovered from the attic of the old Pendleton estate in Akron, which had remained locked and abandoned since their mother's death in 2014. These journals, written entirely in Alexander's true handwriting during the winter of 1997, read like a rehearsal script for a stage play. Page after page revealed that Alexander had spent hours tracing his brother's signature, practicing his vocal inflection, and listing Arthur's private memories, childhood friends, and personal preferences. One chilling entry, dated November 22, 1997, read, "Spoke to Uncle Robert today on the phone. Must remember that Arthur always calls him Bobby, never Robert. A single slip of the tongue will ruin everything. The pressure is immense, but the alternative is a concrete cell." The gallery let out a collective, horrified gasp as the words were read aloud. The raw, sociopathic discipline of the defendant laid out in his own ink for the world to see. The trial then moved into the testimony of the individuals who had unknowingly interacted with the killer while he was actively wearing his brother's identity. The prosecution called 68-year-old Richard Davies, a former senior vice president at the Akron National Bank who had handled the Pendleton corporate accounts in the late 90s. Davies, his face pale as he looked across the room at the frail old man at the defense table, recalled a high-stakes meeting that took place on January 15, 1998. "We had called a mandatory meeting to discuss an immediate $3 million loan default that threatened to freeze the company's assets," Davies testified, his hands gripping the edge of the witness box. The man we believe to be Arthur Pendleton walked into the boardroom. He looked like Arthur. He wore Arthur's favorite tailored charcoal suit, and he sat in Arthur's usual chair. But something about his energy was completely hollow. Arthur was always a fiery, aggressive negotiator who knew every line of our contracts by heart. This man was quiet, overly polite, and agreed to liquidate several prime pieces of commercial real estate without a single fight. We assumed he was simply broken by his twin brother's disappearance. Now, it sickens me to my core to know that we were sitting across from the murderer, helping him cash out the victim's hard-earned life's work. The state produced the financial receipts from those specific liquidations, showing that between January and June of 1998, Alexander, acting as Arthur, successfully sold off over $1.8 million in prime Akron real estate. The proceeds from these sales did not go towards saving the family business or paying off the corporate debts. Instead, the money was systematically routed through a series of anonymous shell companies managed by a corrupt maritime lawyer based in the Bahamas. This financial pipeline was the foundation of the luxurious life Alexander would eventually construct in Arizona, a fortune baptized in the blood of his identical brother. The prosecution argued that this timeline completely eliminated any possibility of a sudden panic or temporary insanity. It was a cold, sustained corporate execution carried out over the course of hundreds of days right under the noses of the local police. The defense team, realizing the devastating impact of this testimony, attempted a fierce counterattack during their cross-examination of Davies. They tried to suggest that the financial liquidations were a desperate, well-meaning attempt by a surviving brother to keep a sinking family business afloat during an unprecedented crisis. The lead defense counsel questioned whether Davies could definitively prove that the man in the boardroom wasn't actually Arthur himself, fighting through immense personal grief and cognitive exhaustion. "Isn't it true, Mr. Davies, that intense psychological trauma can completely alter a person's demeanor, negotiation style, and memory?" the attorney barked. But Davies remained unmoving, his eyes fixed on the defendant. "Trauma changes a man's spirit, counselor," Davies replied coldly. "But it doesn't change the way he signs a multi-million-dollar check. It doesn't give him a microtremor that matches his brother's criminal file." The afternoon session took a deeply emotional turn when the prosecution introduced a series of recorded telephone messages left on the answering machine of Eleanor Pendleton during the spring of 1998. The elderly mother, whose health had rapidly declined following the disappearance of her son, had kept the tapes in a shoebox under her bed until her dying day, always hoping that a random tip would lead her to the truth. The courtroom fell into a heavy, paralyzed silence as the scratchy, analog audio began to play through the modern courtroom speakers. The voice that emerged was a terrifying, synthesized imitation of Arthur's vocal cadence, artificially altered by a primitive voice-changing device to mask the natural subtle differences between the twins. "Hi, Mom, it's Arthur." The recording played, the low static of the tape filling the room. "I'm calling from an old payphone out west. I know you're hurting, and I know you miss Alexander, but you have to stop looking for him. The police can't help us. He got involved with some very dangerous people, and he's gone. If I come back to Ohio, those same people will come for me. I have to stay hidden for a while to keep the rest of the family safe. I love you, Mom. Please destroy this tape after you listen to it." The cruelty of the recording was psychological warfare in its purest form. The defendant had not only slaughtered his brother, but he had actively manipulated his own dying mother into believing that the victim was a criminal who had brought ruin upon himself, effectively destroying Arthur's reputation, even in death. In the gallery, several distant relatives of the Pendleton family broke down into audible sobs, burying their faces in their hands as the sheer weight of the malice washed over them. Alexander, however, remained entirely frozen at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the small spinning reel of the digital tape player, his face an impenetrable mask of psychopathic detachment. As the judge ordered a late afternoon recess, the legal analysts gathered on the courthouse steps noted that the prosecution had successfully built a seamless bridge of evidence spanning nearly 30 years. They had shown the motive, the execution, the immediate cover-up, and the long-term financial exploitation of the crime. The narrative of a tragic, mysterious kidnapping that had haunted West Market Street for a generation had been completely erased, replaced by the clinical reality of an administrative execution carried out by a brother's hand. The city of Akron, wrapped in the heavy humidity of the July evening, waited with a collective, breathless anticipation for the trial to move toward its final, inevitable conclusion, knowing that the earth had finally given up its secrets and the law was closing in for the final kill. The morning of July 3, 2026, brought a torrential downpour that lashed against the stone columns of the Summit County Courthouse, mirroring the dark, turbulent revelations that were about to unfold inside Courtroom 3B. As the seventh session convened, the prosecution prepared to bridge the final gap between Alexander Pendleton's financial strip mining of his brother's life in Akron and his ultimate, phantom resurrection in the state of Arizona. The legal community recognized that this phase of the trial was critical. The state had to demonstrate exactly how the defendant managed to slip through the dragnet of federal border checks, tax systems, and biometric profiling that emerged in the wake of the turn of the century. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the podium, his expression grim, holding a stack of newly unsealed documents from the Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security. To dissect this masterful escape, the prosecution called to the stand Senior Special Agent Laura Vance, a 20-year veteran of the Identity Fraud and Cyberforensics Division of the FBI. Agent Vance had spent the last 5 months reconstructing the digital ghost trail left by Alexander as he abandoned his true identity in the summer of 1999 and migrated west under the shroud of a dead man's name. Projecting a massive, interconnected timeline onto the courtroom screens, Agent Vance pointed to a series of seemingly minor administrative filings that took place across 3 different states in July 1999. Alexander Pendleton did not simply buy a fake ID on a street corner, Agent Vance testified, her voice resonant and steady. He utilized a highly sophisticated strategy known as identity layering. He took Arthur's legitimate, unblemished background, applied for a replacement Social Security card in a small rural county in Indiana, used that card to secure an international driver's permit in Illinois, and finally landed in Phoenix, Arizona, with a bulletproof financial portfolio that no standard bank verification system would ever flag. The prosecution then introduced a critical piece of evidence recovered from a safety deposit box in Scottsdale, Arizona, which had been registered under a shell corporation named AP Properties, LLC. Inside the box, federal agents discovered a pristine, leather-bound notebook containing a handwritten, exhaustive list of Arthur's personal medical history. The ledger included the exact dates of Arthur's childhood immunizations, the name of his high school guidance counselor, the specific blood pressure medications he had been prescribed in his early 20s, and even the phone numbers of old girlfriends from his college days at Ohio State University. Alexander was terrified of a chance encounter or an insurance physical that would expose him, Agent Vance explained to the jury. He spent his first 5 years in Arizona, living like a spy in enemy territory. He memorized this ledger until Arthur's life became his default setting. If a doctor asked about a scar on his knee, he had a pre-rehearsed story about a high school football game that actually happened to Arthur, not him. It was a level of psychological commitment that borders on absolute madness. The trial then moved into a deeply unsettling examination of how Alexander managed to bypass the medical and dental verification systems that typically catch long-term fugitives. The state called to the stand Dr. Raymond Thorne, a retired forensic odontologist who had consulted for the Ohio State Highway Patrol for over 30 years. Dr. Thorne displayed side-by-side digital scans of the dental records used by the Phoenix philanthropist Arthur Pendleton during a routine root canal procedure in 2004, comparing them with Arthur's original 1995 dental charts from Akron. The comparison was stunning. While the jaw structure and skeletal symmetry were a perfect genetic match due to their identical twin biology, the specific dental work, the fillings, the crown placements, and the wear patterns did not align. Identical twins have the same DNA, but they do not share the same cavities or dental history, Dr. Thorne testified, pointing with his steel stylus at the digital X-rays. In 2004, when the defendant went to a dentist in Phoenix, he claimed he had lost his old records in a house fire in Ohio. The Arizona dentist simply created a new chart based on what he saw in the patient's mouth. What Alexander did was brilliant but deeply sinister. He relied on the fact that no one would ever cross-reference his active dental work in Arizona with a missing persons file in Ohio, because as far as the world was concerned, Arthur Pendleton wasn't missing. He was the one sitting in the dentist's chair. The prosecution then turned its attention to the social circle Alexander built in Arizona, demonstrating how he weaponized his immense wealth to insulate himself from suspicion. The state called 64-year-old Evelyn Sinclair, a prominent Phoenix socialite and philanthropist who had served on the board of several high-profile charitable foundations alongside the defendant during the late 2000s. Sinclair, her voice filled with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, looked directly at the old man in the orange jumpsuit. "He was the most charming, generous man in our circle," she whispered into the microphone. "He donated millions to children's hospitals and local arts programs. But looking back, there were always these strange, terrifying walls around him. He never allowed anyone to take his photograph at gala events. If a photographer approached our table, he would suddenly drop his napkin or turn his face away to talk to a waiter. We always joked that he was just old-fashioned and camera-shy. Now, it makes my skin crawl to realize he was hiding his face from the FBI while pretending to be a saint." The state produced several corporate group photographs from those Arizona galas where Alexander had failed to evade the camera lens. Using modern digital enhancement, the prosecution zoomed in on the defendant's eyes in a 2012 charity group shot. The look captured on his face wasn't one of celebration or joy. It was a cold, hypervigilant glare directed toward the edge of the frame, the look of a hunted animal who knew that every flash of a camera bulb carried the potential for total exposure. The prosecution argued that these photographs proved Alexander was never at peace. He was a man trapped in a golden cage of his own making, forced to maintain a multi-million-dollar philanthropic facade just to keep the world from looking too closely at the blood on his hands. The cross-examination of Sinclair by the lead defense counsel was a calculated attempt to humanize the defendant and shift the narrative toward a theme of redemption. The defense attorney questioned whether a man who had spent nearly 3 decades funding hospitals, helping the homeless, and building communities could truly be characterized as a heartless monster. Is it not possible, Mrs. Sinclair, that the man you knew as Arthur was a truly good soul who dedicated his life to rewriting a tragic past through immense global generosity? The attorney asked, his voice echoing through the silent room. But before Sinclair could answer, Assistant District Attorney Vance leaped to his feet with an immediate, thunderous objection. Objection, Your Honor. Philanthropy paid for with a murdered man's stolen fortune is not redemption. It is an ongoing criminal concealment. The judge sustained the objection, ordering the jury to disregard the defense's line of questioning, but the psychological battle lines had been clearly drawn. As the afternoon session drew to a close, the prosecution introduced a series of confidential financial tax audits from 2018 that showed Alexander had begun quietly converting his massive Arizona real estate holdings into liquid gold bullion and overseas cryptocurrency accounts. This evidence dealt a lethal blow to the defense's claim that Alexander had permanently settled into a peaceful, reformed life. It proved that even in his twilight years, the fugitive was preparing for a sudden, chaotic flight if his stolen identity ever crumbled. The state argued that Alexander knew the advancements in forensic science were closing the distance, and that he was actively building a secondary trapdoor to escape justice yet again. When the court adjourned for the day, the crowds outside the Summit County Courthouse had grown despite the pouring rain, with local residents standing under an ocean of umbrellas to discuss the terrifying discipline required to maintain such a massive, lifelong deception. The city of Akron was no longer just mourning a businessman who vanished on a cold November night in 1997. They were confronting the realization that a human being could completely dissolve his own existence, step into the skin of the brother he murdered, and walk through the world for 29 years without a single shred of remorse. The trial was rapidly hurtling toward its final, explosive chapters, and the ghost of West Market Street was finally pulling the imposter down into the dark earth where the truth had waited for so long. The morning of July 6, 2026, brought a heavy, stagnant humidity that seemed to weigh down the very walls of Courtroom 3B, yet the spectators inside the Summit County Courthouse sat in rigid, breathless silence. As the 8th session of this extraordinary trial commenced, the prosecution prepared to unveil the most technologically advanced and damning phase of its case, the absolute synchronization of modern digital forensics with the historical physical evidence from 1997. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the podium with a cold, unyielding confidence, carrying a black encrypted hard drive that contained the results of a multi-agency digital exhumation. The state's objective was to dismantle any remaining doubt regarding the exact timeline of the murder, proving that while Alexander Pendleton was hiding behind a wall of stolen wealth in Phoenix, his digital ghost was actively betraying him across decades of systemic deception. To deliver this forensic hammer blow, the prosecution called to the stand Dr. Eris Vance, the Chief Mobile Forensics and Cellular Triangulation Specialist for the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Vance, a sharp, clinical expert with decades of experience tracking international fugitives, took the witness stand and adjusted the microphone. Projecting a brilliant, multi-layered 3D digital map of the city of Akron onto the large courtroom screens, he illuminated the geographical grid of West Market Street exactly as it existed on the night of November 14, 1997. For 29 years, this case was treated as a localized mystery because traditional cellular data didn't exist in a way that could track a suspect's precise physical movements. Dr. Vance began, his voice cutting through the silence. However, using a revolutionary process known as historical signal remastering, our team was able to extract the raw, dormant frequency logs from the old analog telecommunication towers that line the Cuyahoga Valley corridor in the late 90s. The courtroom watched in absolute fascination as a small, glowing red materialized on the digital map, representing Alexander Pendleton's personal cellular device on that fateful November night. The data showed that while Alexander had claimed to be physically present at a luxury downtown hotel preparing for a high-level corporate merger, his phone was actually moving in a synchronized, predatory pattern directly behind Arthur's luxury sedan. The digital trail proved with absolute mathematical certainty that Alexander had stalked his twin brother through the dark streets of Akron for over 3 hours, waiting for the precise moment when Arthur would exit the charity gala to collect his vehicle. The red on the screen merged with Arthur's location at exactly 2:14 a.m. on West Market Street, the precise minute that neighbors reported hearing a sudden, sharp acceleration of an unidentified engine speeding away toward the highway. The prosecution then advanced the timeline on the screen, showing the red, migrating away from the crime scene and traveling directly toward the isolated 20-acre property in the Cuyahoga Valley, where Arthur's skeletal remains were ultimately discovered beneath the roots of the ancient oak tree. The phone remained completely stationary at that exact burial coordinate for 3 hours and 47 minutes, a window of time that matched perfectly with the physical labor required to excavate a 6-foot grave in the freezing, clay-heavy Ohio soil. The defendant did not realize that, even in 1997, his phone was leaving a permanent, indelible footprint in the electromagnetic ether, Dr. Vance testified, pointing to the glowing cluster of data on the screen. He thought the darkness of the valley shielded him from the eyes of the law, but science has allowed us to look back through time and watch him dig his brother's grave in real time. The defense table erupted in a flurry of tense, whispered arguments as the lead defense counsel scrambled to launch an aggressive cross-examination. The attorney leaped to his feet, attempting to challenge the scientific reliability of the historical signal remastering technology, arguing that analog tower data from the late 90s was notoriously imprecise and could easily possess a margin of error spanning several miles. Isn't it true, Dr. Vance, that atmospheric conditions, terrain interference, and tower degradation could cause these signals to bounce, placing my client at the burial site when he was actually miles away in a hotel room? The defense attorney barked, his voice filled with a desperate intensity. But Dr. Vance remained entirely unshakable, producing a secondary, independent data set derived from the old security server logs of the Akron Power and Light Grid. "We accounted for signal variance, counselor," Dr. Vance replied coldly. "The cellular data is perfectly backed by the automated digital timestamps of the security gates along the access road to that property. Alexander's private access code was entered at 2:38 a.m., and his vehicle tripped the exit sensor at 6:25 a.m. The machine does not lie, and it does not feel pity." The prosecution then shifted from digital mapping to a horrifying examination of the physical tools used to execute the cover-up, calling to the stand forensic materials expert, Dr. Helena Rossi. Dr. Rossi displayed a series of high-magnification electron microscope photographs of the rusted iron crowbar that had been recovered from the shallow grave alongside Arthur's remains. The images revealed microscopic fragments of automotive paint embedded within the rusted pitting of the metal tool. "We conducted a chemical spectrographic analysis of these paint fragments," Dr. Rossi explained to the jury, her tone clinical and devastating. "The compound matches a highly specific, custom-blended lacquer used exclusively on the 1996 model of Alexander Pendleton's personal coupe. This crowbar wasn't a tool found randomly on the property. It was pulled directly from the trunk of the defendant's own car to finish the lethal work he began on West Market Street." The emotional apex of the afternoon session arrived when the state introduced a newly discovered piece of evidence retrieved from an old, dusty storage locker in Cleveland that had been rented under one of Alexander's earliest fraudulent aliases. Inside the locker, modern investigators had found a sealed VHS tape containing a home movie recorded on Christmas Day, 1997, just 6 weeks after the murder. The courtroom fell into a paralyzed, horrified silence as the video began to play on the screens, showing a festive family living room where a frail, aging Eleanor Pendleton sat opening presents, flanked by the man she believed to be her surviving, deeply grieving son. The video showed Alexander wearing Arthur's favorite silver signet ring, smiling warmly as he handed his mother a beautifully wrapped box containing a diamond necklace purchased with the victim's own credit card. The audio captured the defendant's voice, steady and dripping with a sickening, calculated warmth. Merry Christmas, Mom. I know this year has been an unimaginable nightmare with Alexander missing, but I promise you, as long as I am standing, Arthur will always take care of you. We're going to get through this together. The raw, unadulterated psychopathy of a man looking into his mother's tear-filled eyes, wearing his murdered brother's jewelry, and promising to protect her from a tragedy he personally engineered caused multiple members of the gallery to turn their faces away in disgust. At the defense table, Alexander's stoic facade finally showed a fracture. His jaw tightened, his breathing became heavy and erratic, and a single, involuntary tremor ran through his shackled hands as his own historic words echoed through the room like a curse. As the judge ordered a late afternoon recess, the media outlets broadcasting the trial reported that the state had effectively closed any remaining avenue of escape for the elderly fugitive. The combination of historical cellular triangulation, chemical paint matching, and the devastating psychological weight of the home video had transformed the trial into a legal execution of a 30-year-old lie. The city of Akron, watching the slow, scientific dismantling of the man who had stolen a life, began to feel the heavy, somber approach of a long-delayed justice. The phantom of West Market Street was no longer an unsolved mystery whispered in the dark corners of Ohio taverns. It was a flesh-and-blood killer caught in the inescapable jaws of modern forensic truth, waiting for the final gavel to fall. The morning of July 7, 2026, brought a sharp, unexpected drop in temperature over Summit County, chilling the thousands who had gathered outside the Akron courthouse to witness the closing chapters of the state's monumental case. As the ninth session opened, the courtroom was plunged into the highly secretive world of behavioral analysis and deep psychological reconstruction. The prosecution's goal was to expose the exact internal mechanics of the defendant's mind, to show how a human being could survive 29 years wrapped in the skin of his brother without collapsing under the weight of his own monstrous secret. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stood at the podium, adjusting his notes with a deliberate, chilling calm before calling the state's final major expert witness, Dr. Julian Mercer, a renowned forensic psychologist and former chief profiler for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Dr. Mercer took the stand, carrying an extensive psychological evaluation folder compiled over months of post-arrest interviews, medical history reviews, and covert surveillance behavioral logs. The room fell into an immediate, heavy silence as he began to dissect the fundamental personality structure of Alexander Pendleton. What we're looking at in this case is not a man who snapped under sudden pressure, nor is it a simple case of greed, Dr. Mercer began, his clinical voice carrying an absolute, chilling authority through the microphone. Alexander Pendleton belongs to a highly rare, dangerous category of malignant narcissists who possess a profound capacity for identity compartmentalization. He did not feel guilt for the murder of his brother Arthur, because in his mind, Arthur was merely an obstacle to his own survival and comfort. Once the physical act of elimination was complete, Alexander practiced a psychological process known as ego absorption. He literally convinced himself that he deserved Arthur's life more than Arthur did. The prosecution projected a series of handwritten notes taken during Alexander's clinical evaluations in his federal holding cell over the past month. These notes, scrawled in his true, hesitant handwriting with that telltale microtremor, revealed a disturbing lack of remorse that shocked even the most hardened court reporters. When asked by Dr. Mercer how he managed to sleep at night during his first decade in Phoenix, knowing his brother's skeleton was rotting under a tree in Akron, Alexander had coldly replied, "Why should I have lost sleep? The business was saved, my mother was taken care of, and the money didn't go to waste. I lived a good life. Arthur would have ruined it with his conservative fears anyway. I didn't destroy a life, I optimized it." The gallery let out a low, collective murmur of disgust at the reading of the quote, the raw, chilling psychopathy of the defendant laid bare in his own clinical admissions. Dr. Mercer then walked the jury through the terrifying daily discipline required for Alexander to maintain his dual identity during the height of his social standing in Arizona in the 2010s. The state displayed a highly detailed, color-coded behavioral calendar found hidden inside a locked electronic file on Alexander's secure Phoenix server, titled simply The Daily Inventory. This digital log showed that every evening for over 20 years, Alexander spent exactly 45 minutes reviewing the personal details of Arthur's life before going to sleep, ensuring his memory never slipped. The inventory included lists of names of people he had met that week under Arthur's identity, notes on whether he had accidentally used a phrase that belonged to his true self, and detailed records of his physical health compared to Arthur's historical medical trends. He lived in a constant state of total cognitive mobilization, Dr. Mercer testified, pointing to the rigid, daily structure on the screen. Every conversation he had, every handshake he gave, and every smile he flashed in those high-profile Arizona charity circles was a calculated tactical maneuver. He could never relax, he could never get drunk, and he could never allow himself to speak without thinking first. The psychological toll of maintaining this degree of hypervigilance is catastrophic. Most human minds would fracture within months, but Alexander's narcissism was so absolute that he viewed this life-and-death game of deception as a supreme testament to his own intellectual superiority over the entire justice system. The defense team, recognizing that this behavioral testimony was sealing their client's fate as an unredeemable monster, launched a fierce, aggressive cross-examination designed to pathologize his actions. The lead defense attorney stepped forward, attempting to argue that Alexander was suffering from a severe, undiagnosed dissociative identity disorder brought on by the immense financial trauma and family pressures of 1997. Is it not true, Dr. Mercer, that a person under extreme, life-shattering stress can experience a complete psychological break, causing them to truly believe they are someone else as a desperate survival mechanism? The attorney demanded, his voice rising in an attempt to garner sympathy from the jury. But Dr. Mercer remained entirely unmoved, his sharp gaze fixed on the defense table. There is a profound difference between a psychological break and an engineered corporate takeover of a human existence, counselor. The doctor replied coldly. A person in a dissociative state does not set up offshore shell companies in the Bahamas, forge signatures with microscopic precision, or keep a handwritten map to their brother's grave in their crawl space. This wasn't a break from reality. It was a highly organized, 30-year exploitation of reality. The afternoon session took a stunning turn when the prosecution introduced a final, devastating piece of physical evidence that had been recovered from the Arizona mansion just 48 hours prior, hidden inside the lining of an old leather briefcase that Alexander had carried with him since his departure from Ohio in 1999. Inside the hidden compartment, federal forensic technicians had discovered Arthur's original, water-damaged pocket watch, the very timepiece that had been photographed by the original investigators on the dashboard of the idling sedan on West Market Street before it mysteriously vanished from the police evidence locker in early 1998. The state called to the stand retired property clerk Thomas Vance, who had managed the Akron Precinct's evidence room during the late 90s. Vance, now an old man visibly shaken to be involved in the historic scandal, admitted under oath that Arthur Pendleton had come to the station in January 1998, utilizing his identity as the surviving brother to request a personal viewing of the vehicle's recovered contents. He told me he wanted to keep his brother's watch as a memento to remember him by, Vance whispered, his voice trembling with guilt. He looked so utterly devastated, and we were so sloppy back then. I didn't think twice about letting him sign for it and take it out of the box. To know now that I handed the victim's watch directly back to the monster who killed him. It's a shame I will carry to my grave. The prosecution took the watch and displayed it on the presentation screen, showing that the internal hands of the mechanism had permanently frozen at exactly 2:18 a.m., the precise moment the blunt force trauma had shattered the crystal face on that cold November night in 1997. It was a spectacular, undeniable anchor to the moment of execution, a voice from the dead that had traveled across 3 decades inside the killer's own briefcase to condemn him. The state argued that Alexander kept the watch not out of guilt, but as a sick, twisted trophy of his ultimate victory over the authorities, a physical reminder that he had walked into a police station, stolen a piece of murder evidence, and walked out without a single person stopping him. As the judge ordered the evening adjournment, The legal commentators broadcasting from the courthouse steps noted that the state had effectively rested its case on a mountain of unassailable forensic, digital, and psychological truth. Alexander Pendleton sat alone at the defense table as the security detail approached, his silver hair catching the stark courtroom lights, his stoic facade completely shattered by the day's revelations. The city of Akron, wrapped in the cold, biting wind of the July evening, stood on the precipice of a historic verdict, knowing that the ghost of Arthur Pendleton had finally stripped the impostor of his stolen warmth, leaving him shivering in the unforgiving light of justice. The morning of July 8, 2026, witnessed an unprecedented gathering outside the Summit County Courthouse. A quiet, solemn crowd filled the public square, standing shoulder to shoulder under a gray, unyielding sky. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere had shifted from the analytical precision of the past days to a heavy, almost theatrical tension as the trial of Alexander Pendleton moved into its penultimate phase, the closing arguments. The state had built an unassailable fortress of evidence, linking the digital ghost trail of the 20th century to the advanced genetic engineering of the 21st. Now, it was time for Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance to deliver the final narrative arc that would weave these 3 decades of horror, greed, and deception into a single, cohesive demand for absolute justice. Vance stepped to the center of the courtroom floor, his posture immaculate, his gaze scanning the faces of the jurors who had sat through weeks of devastating testimony. He did not use digital screens or slide projections this morning. Instead, he stood before them with nothing but the raw power of the truth. For 29 years, this community lived under the shadow of an engineered ghost story, Vance began, his deep voice vibrating through the silent room. Every citizen of Akron who drove past West Market Street on a cold winter night looked at that curb and wondered what dark, faceless phantom could snatch a good man from an idling vehicle without leaving a trace. We blamed the darkness. We blamed the lack of security. We blamed a cruel, random world. But today, the light of science and the unyielding march of justice have stripped away the illusion. The monster wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. The monster was a mirror image. The prosecutor walked slowly toward the defense table, stopping just 3 feet from where Alexander Pendleton sat hunched in his orange jumpsuit, his frail hands gripping the wooden armrests of his chair. "Look at him," Vance commanded the jury, pointing a decisive finger at the defendant. "He sits before you pretending to be an old, broken man crushed by the weight of time. But do not let this final performance deceive you. Inside that chest beats the heart of a master illusionist, a man who looked into the tear-filled eyes of his own dying mother for 15 years and spoke to her using the artificially modulated voice of the son he had slaughtered. He did not merely kill his identical twin brother, Arthur. He executed a corporate raid on a human life. He stole Arthur's name, he stole Arthur's money, he stole Arthur's home, and he buried Arthur's bones beneath the roots of an anonymous tree so that he could live like a king in the deserts of Arizona." Vance then systematically reviewed the absolute certainty of the physical and forensic assets the state had presented, building a chronological hammer blow that left no room for reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury of the chemical spectrographic analysis that matched the paint from Alexander's personal 1996 coupe to the microscopic fragments embedded in the rusted iron crowbar found in the grave. He recalled the revolutionary epigenetic testing that proved the sweat on the steering wheel belonged to a twin experiencing intense financial panic, matching Alexander's timeline of imminent bankruptcy rather than Arthur's stable reality. He detailed the historical cellular triangulation that tracked Alexander's phone as it stalked Arthur from the charity gala directly to the isolated Cuyahoga Valley property, remaining stationary for the exact hours required to dig a 6-foot grave in the freezing clay. The defense wants you to believe that this was a tragedy of circumstance, a sudden panic, or an undiagnosed mental fracture. Vance continued, his voice rising with a controlled, righteous indignation. But a man in a panic does not practice his brother's signature thousands of times in a hidden journal. A man in a panic does not systematically route millions of dollars through anonymous shell companies in the Bahamas 18 months before he ever flees the state. A man in a panic does not walk into a police evidence locker under the guise of a grieving brother and steal the victim's pocket watch to keep as a sick, psychopathic trophy inside his leather briefcase for 30 years. This was an administrative execution. It was a cold-blooded, meticulously calculated elimination of a human being designed to afford the defendant a life of unearned luxury. The courtroom remained completely paralyzed, the silence so absolute that the distant hum of the building's ventilation system sounded like a low growl. When Vance finally concluded his address, asking the jury to return a verdict of guilty on all counts, aggravated murder, kidnapping, grand theft, and identity fraud, several members of the panel were visibly nodding, their expressions hardened by the overwhelming weight of the truth. The prosecutor walked back to his table, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake, a void that the defense team now had to enter with the impossible task of defending a 3-decade-old lie. The lead defense counsel stepped forward, his expression weary but determined, launching into a desperate, emotionally charged final appeal that attempted to exploit the themes of human frailty and the passage of time. He argued that the state's case, while mathematically impressive, was built entirely on circumstantial reconstructions and advanced technologies that didn't even exist when the crime took place. He tried to paint Alexander not as a calculating monster, but as a young man who had been caught in a catastrophic financial vice, suggesting that Arthur's death may have been the result of a tragic accident during a heated argument rather than in premeditated execution. "Look at the life my client lived in Arizona," the attorney pleaded, his voice cracking with a manufactured passion. For 29 years, he built communities, funded children's hospitals, and lived a peaceful, faultless existence. Is that the behavior of a monster? Or is that the behavior of a man who spent every single day of his life trying to redeem himself for a terrible, youthful mistake that he could never take back? But the defense's arguments felt hollow, like dry leaves scraping against the stone floor of the courthouse, completely incapable of standing against the concrete reality of the forensic evidence. The state's rebuttal was swift, clinical, and devastating. Marcus Vance stood up one final time, holding Arthur's shattered pocket watch in his open palm, the frozen hand still pointing directly at 2:18 a.m. "Philanthropy paid for with a murdered brother's stolen blood is not redemption," Vance whispered, looking directly into the eyes of the jury. "It is the ultimate act of concealment." The clock stopped for Arthur Pendleton 29 years ago in the dark of the Cuyahoga Valley. It is time for the law to start ticking again. With those final words, the judge formally charged the jury, instructing them on the legal definitions of premeditation, malice, and absolute certainty before ordering them to retire to the deliberation room to determine Alexander Pendleton's fate. As the 12 men and women filed out of the courtroom, the security detail moved in, clicking a fresh set of iron shackles around the old man's ankles. Alexander did not look at his attorneys, he did not look at the media cameras, and he did not look at the remaining family members who watched him with cold, tearless eyes. He simply allowed himself to be led back down into the concrete holding cells beneath the courthouse, his heavy chains clanking against the floor in a rhythm that sounded exactly like a countdown. The city of Akron, wrapped in the quiet anticipation of the July afternoon, held its breath, knowing that the longest run from justice in Ohio history was finally coming to its absolute, inevitable end. The deliberation room of the Summit County Courthouse was a pressure cooker of collective historical responsibility, but the 12 men and women of the jury did not require days to untangle the web of deception that had baffled the state of Ohio for nearly 30 years. For exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes, the room remained locked, the low, murmuring hum of their voices occasionally rising through the heavy oak doors as they reviewed the unassailable mountain of forensic data. They did not need to debate the science, the historical cellular triangulation, the chemical spectrographic lacquer matching on the crowbar, the epigenetic stress markers left on the steering wheel, and the horrifying sociopathic admission on the home video left no room for doubt. When the buzzer finally rang 3 sharp, definitive times through the courthouse corridors, signaling that a unanimous verdict had been reached, a synchronized wave of adrenaline and solemn relief rippled through the packed gallery. The courtroom filled for the final time with an almost suffocating gravity, the heavy silence broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of media camera shutters and the anxious shifting of feet in the public rows. When Alexander Pendleton was led back into courtroom 3B by 4 heavily armed sheriff's deputies, his physical appearance seemed to have degraded further over the hours of waiting, his frail frame swallowed by the bright orange jumpsuit, his eyes staring blankly at the defense table. He looked no longer like the polished, untouchable Arizona millionaire who had manipulated high society for decades, but like a phantom whose illusions had been permanently dissolved by the harsh light of forensic reality. Judge Evelyn Vance took her place at the bench, her face a mask of uncompromising legal authority, and looked down at the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice echoing through the breathless chamber. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing tall and holding a single sheet of paper with a steady hand. The clerk took the paper, her voice ringing out with a clinical, historic clarity that dropped into the silent room like a sequence of artillery fire. On the first count of aggravated, premeditated murder, the jury found the defendant, Alexander Pendleton, guilty. On the second count of kidnapping, guilty. On the third count of grand theft and embezzlement, guilty. On the final count of systemic identity fraud and compounding a felony, guilty. Each pronouncement was a hammer blow that permanently stripped the impostor of his stolen warmth, returning the narrative of West Market Street to the victim who had waited beneath the clay of the Cuyahoga Valley for 29 years. In the front row of the gallery, the remaining distant relatives of the Pendleton family closed their eyes, a quiet, collective sigh escaping their lips as the heavy burden of 3 decades of agonizing uncertainty was finally lifted from their shoulders. Before passing sentence, Judge Vance turned her sharp, unforgiving gaze directly onto the defendant, allowing a long, agonizing pause to fill the room before she spoke, her words cutting through the air like an ice-cold wind. "Alexander Pendleton, you are an anomaly in the history of Ohio jurisprudence, a man whose level of calculated cruelty and psychopathic discipline has left this entire community profoundly shaken," she said, her voice trembling slightly with a controlled, judicial fury. "You did not merely take a human life in a moment of passion or financial panic. You executed your own identical twin brother, a man who shared your face, your voice, and your mother's love. You did it to steal his very existence, to clean out his bank accounts, and to build a monument of unearned luxury in the desert while his bones rotted beneath a tree. You spent nearly 3 decades pretending to be the victim, weaponizing the empathy of your dying mother and the grief of this town to shield yourself from the law. There is no redemption deep enough, no philanthropy generous enough, to wash the blood from your hands." With a sharp, decisive strike of her gavel, Judge Vance handed down the maximum possible penalty allowed by law, life in prison without the absolute possibility of parole, to be served at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, ensuring that Alexander would spend the remainder of his natural days inside a concrete cell, stripped of both his stolen fortune and his freedom. The elderly killer did not flinch, he did not cry out, and he did not look back at the gallery as the deputies stepped forward to double-shackle his wrists and ankles. The heavy iron chains clanked violently against the linoleum floor as he was led out through the side door of the courtroom, a hollow, rhythmic sound that served as the final, definitive punctuation mark to the longest run from justice in the history of the state. Outside the courthouse walls, the gray July storm had finally broken, allowing a sudden, bright beam of afternoon sunlight to pierce through the overcast canopy and illuminate the bustling streets of Akron. The media crews began dismantling their satellite towers, the journalists rushed to file their front-page breaking news bulletins, and the crowds that had stood vigil for weeks began to quietly disperse into the city. The narrative that had haunted West Market Street for a generation had been irrevocably changed. It was no longer a ghost story about a man who stepped out of his idling car and vanished into thin air, but a cautionary tale of a crime undone by the relentless, unyielding advancement of human science and the absolute certainty of the law. A few miles away, near the jagged cliffs of the Cuyahoga Valley property, the ancient oak tree where Arthur Pendleton's remains had been hidden stood silent in the fresh summer breeze, The deep trench dug by the forensic excavators now filled back with rich, fresh soil. In the coming weeks, a small, dignified memorial stone would be placed at the site by the community, permanently engraving Arthur's true name into the landscape, ensuring that his memory would never again be used as a shield by the monster who betrayed him. The grand illusion was over. The mask had been shattered, and as the afternoon sun began to set over the rolling Ohio hills, the deep, suffocating chill that had settled over the town for 29 years finally dissolved, leaving behind only the quiet, lasting warmth of a long-delayed justice. The steel-reinforced doors of courtroom 3B swung shut for the final time, sealing away the echo of the gavel, but the profound tectonic shift within the soul of Akron, Ohio, was only just beginning. As the evening of July 8, 2026, blanketed the city in a quiet, reflective violet, the administrative aftermath of the state's most devastating trial began its slow, clinical operations. The media vans that had choked the perimeter of the public square for weeks shifted into low gear, their satellite dishes retracting like mechanical insects, leaving behind a community that felt suddenly hollowed out by the sheer magnitude of the truth. Alexander Pendleton was no longer an active combatant against the American justice system. He was an inmate number, a bureaucratic entry destined for the absolute isolation of the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Yet, the systemic shockwaves of his 29-year grand illusion were continuing to dismantle institutions, corporate legacies, and the collective memory of everyone who had ever crossed his path. Inside the state attorney's headquarters, a specialized cleanup task force of federal forensic accountants, asset forfeiture specialists, and estate lawyers gathered under the harsh hum of fluorescent lights to begin the monumental task of unwinding the financial empire of the imposter. The legal reality was a labyrinth of unprecedented proportions. Every contract signed, every property deed transferred, and every charitable trust established by the Phoenix philanthropist, Arthur Pendleton, over the past 2.5 decades was fundamentally invalid, built on the fraudulent exploitation of a dead man's identity. The state was now tasked with tracing the lineage of over $40 million in liquid and fixed assets, determining how to systematically return stolen capital to the remnants of the original Akron real estate firm while preserving the funding of the innocent Arizona medical foundations that had unknowingly accepted the proceeds of fratricide. To document this ultimate financial autopsy, the state called a final post-trial press briefing where senior assets analyst Catherine Vance presented a comprehensive post-mortem of Alexander's Western holdings. "We're looking at a total institutional collapse of identity validation," Vance explained to the gathered assembly of financial journalists. Alexander Pendleton weaponized the primitive, decentralized banking networks of the early digital era. Because he operated under the flawless, unblemished credit history of his brother Arthur, he was able to secure massive commercial loans in the early 2000s that allowed him to outinvest legitimate developers in the Southwest. He wasn't just a smart investor. He was an investor playing with a ghost's deck of cards, completely immune to the personal liabilities that govern ordinary citizens. The unwinding of these accounts will take years, representing a complex corporate archaeology that will redefine fraud prevention protocols across the banking sector for a generation. As the state worked to dismantle the financial phantom, a far more somber and meticulous process was occurring at the Summit County Medical Examiner's facility, where the physical remains of Arthur Pendleton were finally being released from the cold custody of forensic science. For months, his skeletal structure had been subjected to the invasive scrutiny of lasers, chemical reagents, and 3D digital mapping tools, transformed into a portfolio of exhibits designed to destroy his brother's defense. Now, stripped of its legal utility, the physical envelope of Arthur's life was returned to the hands of a small, dignified committee of distant cousins and childhood friends who had refused to let his memory be entirely erased by the horror of the trial. The logistics of Arthur's final journey were